So can you tell us about some other exhibits besides the Women in Rock?
Sure. We, besides one large permanent temporary exhibit, we always have 2 or 3 other ones, and almost always we have a photography exhibit. And right now we have one that's women on film. There are 2 ladies in Cleveland who have been photographing rock concerts for 40 years, and so we've got one of them, her exhibit up, and that'll be up for about 6 months. Then we're going to do an exhibit on the Specialty label. Specialty was one of the first labels started in 1946 in Hollywood, really recording race music, which is then later on called rhythm and blues, as I mentioned. And we'll do the history of that. We often do small exhibits to allow us to capture anniversary dates or something of that nature. And they usually stay up for a year or 2, and sometimes they travel.
Okay. My father, I know, sent you an email a while ago complaining about...
Is he a Rush fan? Moody Blues, Chicago? Which one? Is it Kiss?
He's actually a Hall & Oates fan.
Oh, okay, that one too. Yep.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of criticism for the induction process because people haven't gotten their favorite band inducted. Can you tell us about the induction process, how it works?
Sure, and I think one of the words used is their favorite band. I'll explain the process, and as I tell folks that I get these emails, probably about 10,000 a year, complaining about this, and sometimes I try to answer all of them. Some of them are really ugly and difficult to answer, but oftentimes I'll put a PS that says, "So, our job is to be very objective and nominate and induct the bands we think have had an impact and influence or have been innovative and excellence in music. And I'd like you to send me an email back and name the 5 bands that you hate that have to be inducted." And in 10 years, nobody's ever responded to that. Because virtually no one writes to me about a band they don't like. And I hardly ever get to nominate a band that I'm really crazy about. But I'm looking at artists that I think should be inducted. Basically, there are 4 categories of inductees: performers, early influence, non-performers, and musical excellence. And musical excellence covers things like sidemen and things of that nature. So in the performing category, there are 40 of us that nominate, and that committee is made up of folks like Little Steven from Bruce's band, Paul Schaefer from the Letterman Show, people in industry, journalists, writers, critics, professors, a very broad, diverse group of men, women, and different races, trying to make sure we've got ages and everything covered, because it's just the nature of how you think about the music. So your only hard criteria is you had to have a recording 25 years ago. Now that's becoming an issue right now, and I used to kid about this, the fact that the way bands work today and they work at home and they upload stuff would be hard. There's no tangible evidence of that first recording. It used to be a record, then a cassette, and a CD, and now. So we're going to start a registry shortly on Facebook where bands will send us their first recording. We'll archive it in our library and archives, and then we'll start the clock tolling, so there's actually some point where you know if you're eligible. But we go into this committee and we nominate 3 artists each, and we talk about what they've done musically. We don't talk about how many records they sold, how many #1 hits they had. In fact, you're not allowed to talk about that. You have to talk about why the band or the artist is important musically, what they've done innovatively or impactfully. And we have a sort of iterative voting process. We spend most of the day together, and out of the room will come about 15 candidates that is then sent to a voting committee of 600. And the voting committee, the largest block of voters, are 400 living inductees. And then there's another 200 people like myself, again, writers, journalists, critics, people in the industry. So it's a very diverse group. But you get right down to it, it's the living inductees who are the biggest difference maker when it comes to voting. So when I get all these complaints, I usually say, well, write Bruce, write Ozzy, write Prince, write Bonnie Raitt. You know, these are the people that are actually selecting it. And you know, a couple years ago, I have been nominating Kiss for about 5 years. And I finally got them on the ballot. And that same year, ABBA got on the ballot, which people have a hard time understanding how ABBA is rock and roll. But if you really want to think about it musically, ABBA comes out of the Beatle Elvis Presley songbook, not the Gershwin Irving Berlin songbook, but it's translated to Swedish. So we look at that, and we look at the impact of that group. I mean, when you get behind the Beatles and Michael Jackson and Elvis, probably somewhere in there, ABBA's as important musically around the world as anybody. I mean, they just are. You can see many of the British bands from the 80s and 90s will tell you they were very much influenced by ABBA, which sounds very outside of the box for it. So Kiss doesn't get in, ABBA gets in. 10,000 emails, you know, dear moron, dear idiot, this sort of thing. So it is a very methodical, disciplined process. Hall & Oates, your dad mentioned, okay, the biggest selling duet of all time. Great songwriters. You know, unlike some groups that sold lots of records and very popular, they wrote their own music. Very creative, and at the same time, they've just never gotten any traction in the nominating committee. I wish they would. I'm a huge Hall & Oates fan. I would love to see them get nominated. I'd love to see them get inducted. But then I have about 30 bands and artists I like that myself, and I just never get around to nominating them. I've got my fingers crossed that they will get inducted at some point.
I'm laughing with Rich and Marlon because they're actually my favorite band, along with my dad. So
I can see you've been brainwashed. But the other three categories, the early influences and the non-performers and musical excellence, are all done by committees. And again, hopefully every year the early influence is really an homage to many of the black artists, particularly that came before the Big Bang period of rock and roll, which is Elvis and Bill Haley in the 50s. It's not where it starts. As I said, there is no first rock and roll record. People like to argue about it, and my license plate is Rockert 88, which is a song from 1951 by Ike Turner and Jackie Brinston, which a lot of people think is the first rock and roll. It is not, but it's still a great license plate. So, you know.
I know you mentioned this in the other segment, but in case someone's just tuning in now, some artists aren't necessarily what people would call rock and roll. Like, I know you said ABBA, not everyone would consider rock and roll. I believe Madonna's been inducted, Run DMC, so could you explain, in case someone's just listening now, why they are considered rock and roll to you?
Well, because this all comes out of the same syncopations and beats that came out of Africa. And this music, the irregularity of it, is what allows artists to be very creative. You know, classical music and European music had a very set sort of formula to it. With the rise of black music, you do almost anything you want to. And we see this as a river of music that continues to evolve. And I grew up in the 50s, okay? So a lot of the artists that I think of rock and roll artists now, I have to defend that they weren't. Connie Francis, who was one of the most popular female singers in the 50s and 60s, everybody calls her a pop artist. But I lived the time, and she was called a rock and roll artist. So you can be very recidivist about this and revisionary and look back and say, well, that's not rock and roll. But there's no way you can define it. You can't put any set of elements on a piece of paper and say, this defines rock and roll. I mean, it's been defined by a lot of artists like it's music of the youth, it's a music of attitude. You can't put down certain instruments or certain subject matter and say that's rock and roll. So we broadly define it that way, and most musicologists do the same thing, and that's what's important to us, that people understand that it is not one set of ingredients that come out to make this. So we're always going to be controversial. Madonna was controversial. Miles Davis was inducted, not as an early influence, which he could have been, or some other categories inducted, and he kept getting nominated by and voted on by, you know, the living inductees. So we know it's subjective. We recognize it's subjective, and that's the way it's always going to be. It's not going to be like baseball and all the sports Hall of Fames where they have statistics, and you either played baseball or you didn't play baseball. This is an art form that's very malleable and one that continues to challenge us. And you know, I promise you, 15 years from now, if you have kids and you're listening to whatever they're listening to, you're going, boy, I don't get that stuff. Your ears stop growing. They sort of stop, and it's a big challenge for all of us to do what we do, to keep listening and say, you know, this new music is rock and roll, or that music was rock and roll.
Has your favorite artist been inducted?
A lot of them. I mean, you know, as I said, I've got 500,000 records, so I listen to everything. I try to listen to everything, as much new stuff as I can. I listen to a lot of hip hop, and so, you know, we've only inducted 2 hip hop artists, Grandmaster Flash and Run DMC. LL Cool J's been on the ballot twice now and just hasn't gotten the votes. But we're coming into a period which I think is very important in hip hop, because shortly Public Enemy and NWA, which are 2 very, very formative artist groups that will be eligible in the next couple of years. It'll be interesting to see if they get inducted. And then in the 90s, when you get into, eventually get into Kanye, you get into Diddy and all these artists that were so important in that area, it's going to be interesting to see if they get inducted. I think we'll have a lot more hip-hop at that time. But I keep hoping some of the groups from the 50s will be remembered and inducted. And even, you know, people like Hall & Oates, you know, very important. You know.